Was there anyone bigger or better that you've ever covered than Muhammad Ali?
There's been no one bigger. Ali was lovable, but he was also could be very vicious. The Thrilla in Manila has got to be the most brutal fight I've ever covered in my life.
Hagler versus Hearns. Was you at that?
I was in awe of what I just seen.
This is the George Groves Boxing Club. I'm George Groves. I'm with me old mucker Deck, and we have Colin Hart in with us today.
Yeah, Colin, welcome. The titan of the press box. What term do you like? Behemoth, legend. we could keep going.
Just Colin.
Colin, like it. What we did realise before is strange because George, you're now interviewing Colin.
Yeah.
There was a time, Colin.
Yeah, I was saying to George when before we start this interview, it's an irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
I spent my entire life interviewing boxers, and this is the first time a boxer's going to interview me. So it's a switch of roles.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Well, it's got to be, Colin, because every one of us, boxing fan or not, who wants to know some Muhammad Ali stories, some of these big characters that you followed. And I mean, was there anyone bigger or better that you've ever covered than Muhammad Ali?
There's been no one bigger. I'm not saying he was the best fighter I've ever seen, pound for pound, because in my opinion he wasn't. But as a character, I mean, he didn't get voted the sports personality of the 20th century for nothing. He was also one of the bravest men I've ever met. Not for what he did in the ring, which was brave enough. It's what he did outside the ring. Now, my wife is an American from the South. She's from Tennessee. So I know all about the South. I've been there many, many times with family all over Southern America. And when Ali was in exile, he used to give talks to university campuses all over the country about human rights. And of course, that was after what he said about Vietnam. And he was hated in the South. And when I say how brave he was, when you think the Kennedys, both of them were assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and yet he used to stand up and campaign for human rights, and he was putting himself up there in the open, and he could have got a bullet any time, and I thought he was going to get shot.
Yeah.
And yet he kept on and on and on. And that's where, to me, he was one of the bravest men I've ever met.
Can you wheel it back? So when your first impressions and first hearings of Muhammad Ali or Cassius Clay, I assume, went in the Olympics, can you remember the first
No,
time
I didn't cover the Olympics, Deck. I first met Ali in 1963 when he came over to fight Henry Cooper at Wembley Stadium, non-title fight. And he was disliked intensely in this country when he first came over. He was 21, a very brash American, giving it all with Cooper gives me any jive, he'll fall in 5. And that wasn't the British way. Boasting was not a British trait back in 1963. So he was very much disliked. And of course, you know what happened at Wembley. That was the famous night when that left hook from Cooper's put him on the deck. And I swear, I can't be sure, if that round had lasted another 20 seconds, Cooper would have knocked him out. Because nobody finished the fight quicker or better than Henry Cooper when he had a man going. The bell saved him. But of course, then the myth started. I mean, over the years, it got more, instead of being the round, in between rounds, between the 4th and the 5th, being 2 minutes, suddenly it ended up being 10 minutes. Angelo Dundee split the glove, which he didn't. They tried to change the gloves, which they couldn't, because there was no spare gloves at ringside. And don't forget, this is at Wembley Stadium, and if they tried to get the new gloves, they'd have had to go back to the dressing room, back to the ring. It would have taken 15 minutes. So they carried on. What had happened, the glove on the left hand split, and the stuffing started to come out. Back then, that was all horsehair. And when when Clay got back to his corner, Dundee tried to make the split worse. And he called Tommy Little, I think was the referee, over and said, we can't go on because the gloves split. You've got to change the gloves, which I told you they couldn't. So they allowed the fight to go on with the glove still split. And the rest, as they say, is history. He started to cut poor Henry's eyes to pieces, and Tommy Little had to stop it. But I have the video of that fight, and I timed it. The extra time between the 4th and the 5th rounds, believe it or not, was just 5 seconds. But, as George will tell you, that could be vital to any fighter, that extra 5 seconds to help his recovery. Anyway, that was the myth.
Only 5 seconds.
Only 5 seconds.
Okay.
Well, you heard it here.
Yeah.
Colin Hart, the only person there covering it that clearly. That is amazing. So that's the first time you see Cassius Clay.
Yeah.
Are you hooked on Cassius Clay now? Are you following his career from there on in, or do you not hear about him until...
No, I didn't, because I was not the boxing correspondent then. I was the number 2 guy. I was really a dog's body, getting the quotes, going backwards and forwards.
I know that feeling.
Time in the corners.
I really started to know Ali after he came back from exile. The first fight I covered in the United States was imprinted on my brain. March the 8th, 1971, Madison Square Garden, the fight of the century, the first Ali Frazier fight. And from that moment, I covered most of his major fights until his last fight, which was in the Bahamas in 1981. So I had 10 years on the road with Ali. 10 unforgettable roller coaster years. Every day was a joy to be with him. And I must say, I know that second fight with Cooper was in 66. And all the time, every time I met him, after he fought Cooper the second time, his first question to me was, how's Henry Cooper doing?
Yeah.
The respect he had for Cooper was immense.
Yeah. When you're following Ali, do you have any inkling on what you need to be covering that day? Like what could he possibly say? What might be different? What will people actually really want to hear and read?
Well, I'll give you, every day was different, as I said. Now, I'll give you a classic Ali example. And I wish boxers in this country, particularly today, and I'm talking about Anthony Joshua, who is so protected by the people around him that people like me cannot get near him, only by like getting an invitation to meet the king. Not only me, all the boxing writers in my era had Muhammad Ali's home telephone number. Right. Now I'll give you a classic example. He was no longer champion. He was fighting Al Blue Lewis in Dublin. He used to call himself then the People's Champion. And he was flying into Dublin from New York, and my great friend and colleague, who unfortunately died in June, Alan Hubbard, and I said, we'll fly into Dublin and catch the press conference at the airport. British Airways, not surprisingly, was delayed.
Shout out British Airways.
So I won't get a free trip on British Airways now.
We're still open for sponsors, though.
We flew into Dublin, the press conference was over. He was staying at the Oppenheim Country Club, which was about in the Wicklow Mountains outside of Dublin. So we jumped into a cab, went to the Oppenheim Country Club and went into the lobby. Standing there was Angelo Dundee, Odessa, who was Ali's delightful mother and father, and one or two other of his entourage. And we said to Angelo, where's the champ? He said, he's tired out. He's also got a bit of a cold and he's gone to bed. And Alan and I said, oh my goodness. Well, he said, well, what's the problem? I said, well, we've got to do an interview with him and he won't be up till about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And Angela said, go and wake him up. And we thought he was joking. He wasn't joking. So we followed Angelo down the corridor, banged on the door, and he shouted, get up, champ. The British press are here to see you. And he was sharing a room with his brother, Ratman. Ali, bleary-eyed, he woke him up, opened the door. He said, the British press want to see you. Send them in.
How's Henry Cooper?
We sat there for over 2 hours, and we didn't leave until our notebooks was full. And what he was saying that day, we weren't talking about boxing so much. His first wife, Belinda, I forget how many kids he had at that time, and he was complaining about the cost of his wife and children, what it cost him, and he went through the family budget, and this was all right. Right. I mean, eventually we started talking about boxing, but that was the man. I mean, he once he saw a notebook or camera, he'd go off on one.
Yeah.
Take the notebook and camera away. He was as quiet as a mouse. And of course, what we saw of him in the ring. I mean, as you know, when he fought Foreman in Zaire, the general consensus was that he was going to get so badly beaten that there was not only his life was in danger, he would probably end up in hospital. I had this thing about Foreman, that he was so big, and I just wondered whether he had the stamina for a long fight. I know he was a tremendous puncher, obviously. And I was with Foreman in Kingston, Jamaica, when he knocked out Frazier to win the title. And I was talking to a guy called Bob Walters, who was a boxing writer of the New York paper, was a New Jersey paper called Newsday. And Bob, I really respected him. He was one of the old-time American boxing writers. And he'd covered Zale and Mark Graziano and all those guys, and I respected his judgment. And I was in the bar having a drink with Bob a few days before the fight, and I said, Bob, I hope you don't think I'm crazy, but I've got a feeling that Ali's going to beat this guy. And he said, you're not crazy, I'm picking Ali to win as well. And I said, why? He said, I was covering Foreman fight, I think it was in Miami, I'm not sure where, and he was fighting an Argentine light heavyweight, Peralta. He said he came to the 10th round, Foreman was winning the fight, but he was totally and utterly exhausted, and he didn't want to go out for the 10th and last round. He couldn't lift his arms. Anyway, they shoved him out there, and of course he won the fight. And I thought that convinced me to pick Ali. That if Bob hadn't said that to me, I may have not had the bottle to do it, because I had this gut feeling. And it's the first time I behaved unprofessionally at ringside. I don't mind.
First and last.
The first and last. When Ali knocked him out, I mean, don't forget, Foreman wasn't knocked out. He wasn't unconscious. He couldn't fight anymore. He was so exhausted, and he never intended to get up. He couldn't go on. But when that fight was over, I have to admit, I was in the press seat, of course. I leapt out my seat and punched the air, because people, I mean, my colleagues had said, you got to be crazy to do what you're doing. Anyway, there was a tradition in Fleet Street, if your man did something outrageous or picked the winner of something, whether it was football, cricket or whatever, Sportscenter sent you what they called a herogram. And I expected a herogram from my Sportscenter to a guy called Frank Nicklin. And I tipped Ali to win in the 9th round. And I got my herogram, and all it said was, why wrong round? And that was Nicklin's way of telling me, don't get big-headed, son.
Yeah.
You know?
Did you anticipate Ali winning like he did, i.e. taking that much punishment?
I got the tactics completely wrong.
You thought he was going to dance?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what he did was the complete opposite. He knew that I suspected that Foreman had a stamina problem. So what did he do? He went up against the ropes and allowed Foreman to punch himself out until he was tired out. Yeah. And it shows you how brave he was. Foreman then was arguably the hardest punching heavyweight there'd ever been.
Yeah.
And yet that's what he did.
Yeah.
And he knew he would eventually exhaust himself, and he just couldn't lift his hands anymore.
Was people, Colin, at the time aware of Ali's mind games? Like now in boxing they talk about mind games, and the press follow you around, the TV networks follow you around. They love it when you get in someone's head. But it feels like, me watching it back now, no one was up to speed with Ali in terms of his mind games. Like, no one was smart enough to say, he's taking a piss, or he's winding you up. Don't let him get in your head. Don't end up fighting his fight.
You're absolutely right, George. And it was very interesting because years later, another heavyweight played mind games, was Mike Tyson. But it was different. Ali's mind games was ridicule. He used to ridicule his opponents. Tyson used to suggest he wanted to kill them. Yeah. That was the difference. I don't think they feared Ali when they went in the ring with his opponents. They feared Tyson because they thought he might well do what he was suggesting he would do. Yeah. So they were both mind games, but different type of mind games. He had nicknames for all his opponents. I mean, Larry Holmes he called the Peanut. He reckoned his head was shaped like a peanut. You see, look, Ali was lovable, but he was also could be very vicious and cruel.
Yeah.
And he was vicious and cruel to Frazier.
Yeah.
He used to call Frazier an Uncle Tom, and as you know, the worst insult one black man can call another, certainly in America, is to call him an Uncle Tom. Frazier was far from an Uncle Tom, but Frazier could stand being called a gorilla by Ali, but he couldn't stand to be called an Uncle Tom, and Ali knew that, and he kept doing that, prodding him, twisting the knife, if you like, Uncle Tom, Uncle Tom. So he could be vicious, he could be cruel. And he was cruel when he fought Ernie Terrell. I didn't cover that fight, but that was when he tortured Terrell. I'm sure he could have knocked him out, but he let it go to 15 rounds. And every time he hit him with a jab, he said, "What's my name?" Because Terrell kept insisting on calling him Clay in the build-up to that fight.
That's like part of Terrell's mind game, which didn't quite
well
work for him.
Fired. We'll move on to Manila in a sec. But what was George Foreman like? Because he's seen now as this kind of happy-go-lucky, jolly kind of salesman.
But I'll tell you, George, when he was world heavyweight champion, was one nasty piece of work. He was one of the biggest men I'd ever seen in my life. Don't forget, we're talking a long time ago. Now they're all giants, right? I mean, he's dwarfed by Fury, who's 6'9", and George was only 6'4". A midget by comparison. But
cruiserweight.
And he used to have a big afro haircut. And he was surly, uncooperative, didn't like the media. Right? He found them a pain to have to sit there and talk to us, answer questions. So we were in Caracas in 1974, and I was covering his defence with Norton. And we said to, forgotten his name now, his publicity chief, Bill, let's call him Bill, American guy, lovely man. And we said, look, there was about 5 British writers covering the fight. We said, can we have a private interview for the Brits with George? He said, I don't know about that. He said, but I'll ask him. Anyway, he persuaded George to do it. And the arrangement was one afternoon about 2 o'clock at his hotel round the pool. He would see us. On the day, we were all there on time. And of course, George kept us waiting a little bit. And I used to chain smoke in those days. I hate to tell you this, players please. Used to smoke like a chimney. And I was standing by the poolside smoking when Big George came along, wearing then his traditional dungarees with no shirt, his huge arms, big afro, looking like he could kill the world. Didn't really want to do it, but Bill had persuaded him. And as he's walking towards the table where we had, he saw me some yards away smoking, and he yelled, "You, put that out." And I looked at him, and I said, "Me?" He said, "Yeah, you." And I said, because I'm an East End boy, and I don't care if he's world heavyweight champion, and he could kill me, I said, "Say please." So that didn't go down well with George. And I was seething. I was sitting there and I thought, how am I going to get back at him? Anyway, he was going on about how proud he was of being an American and all the rest of it, and I couldn't resist it. His previous fight, he knocked out a fella called Joe Roman, who was a small, light heavyweight, in one round in Tokyo, of all places. And I said, don't tell me you were proud of knocking out poor little Joe Roman. And there's a sequel to this. A hand as big as a shovel was coming in my direction to slap me. And if he'd done, it would have probably killed me. And Bill jumped in and said, hey, cut this out, fellas, for heaven's sake, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but I'd got my own back, so I'd got to him. Roll on many years, and I'm in Houston, Texas, and I'm going into the hotel, and Bill is standing on the top of the steps, and I hadn't seen him for a few months. Hey, Bill, good to see you. He said, I'd like to arrange lunch tomorrow with an old friend of yours. I said, oh, yeah, really, who's that? He said, George Foreman. I said, oh, leave me alone. You know I can't stand George, and he can't stand me. He said, that was a long time ago. He said, he's a different guy now. He said, he's a preacher. I said, he's a what? Anyway, he persuaded me to have lunch with George the next day and him. And it was a fight day, Saturday. And I'm standing in the lobby of the hotel, smoking. And suddenly I hear a voice behind me say, hey, you, put that out. I turn round, and it's the George we know today. Looked like a giant Buddha, shaven head, and all the rest of it. And a completely different man. And we had a magnificent lunch. He gave me a great interview, all about him being a preacher and why he gave up the good life and didn't even have a TV, etc., etc., etc. My office was delighted. Roll on a few more years, George had done a book called By George, and we were in Vegas, and he was then working for television, like George is now. And Bill said, George has done a book, and he wants to give you a copy, so we go up to his room, he'll give you a copy. So George and I have gone full circle, and he was in London, must have been a couple of years ago, and I spent time with him. With Scott Ewing, who's a lawyer, and is a lawyer for several fighters. And so, George and I are good friends.
Mm. Can we ask you about the Thrilla in Manila now?
Yeah. As you can imagine, I've covered a lot of fights in near enough 60 years of boxing minor, and a lot of heavyweight fights. Some of them great, some of them awful. The Thrilla in Manila has got to be the most brutal fight I've ever covered in my life. And I use the word brutal advisedly. And the reason it was so brutal is both Ali and Frazier were what I call shot fighters. They couldn't get out of the way of each other's punches. And they stood there for 14 rounds slamming each other non-stop. It was, I say the word brutal, that's what it was.
What do you think that was? Is that because of what was at stake, the people the characters that they were? Neither of them would back down.
Well, they're both very brave men. And as you know, Frazier was absolutely livid when Eddie Futch pulled him out at the end of the 14th round. And with those famous quote, son, it's over. Nobody will ever forget what you've done here today. And of course, the Frazier and his family, to me, Eddie Futch is one of the greatest trainers who ever lived. He actually trained 5 world heavyweight champions. And what he did was absolutely 100% correct. But the Frazier family never forgave him for that, because people felt that Ali was on the point of capitulation. He was so exhausted. And as you know, he collapsed in the centre of the ring. I don't believe that he couldn't have come out for the 15th round. I believe he collapsed. He went on the floor to stop the people mobbing him. After 14 rounds. They were jumping all over him, and he wanted to get out of the way.
I always wonder when Ali says, oh, I'm glad they pulled it then because I wasn't coming out for the 15th. I think, what a cruel thing to say. I always find that a really cruel thing to say, because I think, how does Frazier live with that then after?
In the press conference after that fight, that's when Ali said, "That's the nearest thing. It's the nearest I've ever been to death." And there was another thing that Ali was, in his favour. In that press conference was Frazier's son, Marvin, who at the time I think was about 14 years of age. And Marvin was crying, having seen his father suffer that almighty good hiding and lose the fight. And Ali saw him, and he walked over and put his hand round Marvin and said, "Stop crying, Marvin, your father's a great man." There was that that respect, but Frazier never forgave Ali for treating him the way he did over the Uncle Tom. And I happened to see it and hear it with my own eyes. People forget I was also the athletic correspondent of The Sun, which meant I covered 8 Olympic Games, and Commonwealth Games and all the rest of it. And at the Atlanta Olympics, I happened to be watching breakfast television in my room, and Frazier was being interviewed. And if you remember, Ali, shaking with Parkinson's, lit the torch. And, I like to think I've seen it all, done it all. I've lived through World War II as a child, pretty tough from the East End of London. I don't mind admitting I had a lump in my throat the size of a golf ball that day watching Ali. I thought, oh my goodness, he's not going to do it, lighting that torch. Anyway, the interviewer was talking to Frazier about that moment, and Frazier said they should have thrown him in the fire. He was that bitter. And because Frazier, when he was in exile, Ali was in exile, Frazier gave Ali money. And also drove him from Philadelphia to New York in his car for some, I forget what reason, and had all the conversation on tape. He befriended Ali when he was in exile, and that's why he was so bitter at the way Ali kept attacking him of being an Uncle Tom.
Before we move on from the heavyweights, I just wanted to ask you, you made a good point there about Tyson Fury's size, and he's 6'9", and these guys really would probably be cruiserweights in this day and age, 6'2", 6'3". How would Tyson Fury have done in that era if you plonk him in against those guys as a big 6'9" heavyweight, the switch hitter that he is? Some people think he'd be a match for anyone. You've seen them all. What do you think?
Ali would have beaten him, in my opinion. Larry Holmes would have beaten him, in my opinion.
Competitive?
It would have been an interesting fight, but I think they were too clever and they certainly wouldn't have been mesmerised by Fury's rhetoric and nonsense and all the rest of it. Neither of them would. I just think they were better fighters, pound for pound. I'm not saying it wouldn't have been competitive, but both of them would have found a way. That was the thing about Ali and Holmes. They would have found a way. Like Leonard would find a way. When he fought Hagler, he found a way.
Colin, you said you the only Brit to predict Ali to beat Foreman. You punched the air at the end of that fight. What was the feeling in your stomach at the end of Ali Frazier in Manila?
Well, I was feeling, it's wrong to say a relief, but I was as a boxing fighter, look, I don't live with fighters anymore, but I used to live with fighters. I used to be in their training camp. Not just me, all the boxing fighters of the day. We lived with the guys. They knew our names, except Ali. He didn't know any of our names. He knew who we were. There's only 2 names he knew from Britain. One was my both dear friends and colleagues of mine, Reg Guttridge and Harry Carpenter, because they were television guys. So he knew their names. He knew who we were. So we lived with them. And it was a bit of relief that it was over. He was never the same. I mean, also, he fought Shavers after that. Shavers. Now, you talk to any of those guys, you talk to Norton, Holmes, Cooney, or whoever you talk to, who was the hardest punching heavyweight of that era, to a man, they will tell you Ernie Shavers.
So, Colin, you've told us before we've even started recording today that the Four Kings era, got Leonard, Duran, Hagler, Hearns, that's 4, isn't it?
Yeah, that's 4.
And they had 9 fights, and you was there for 7 of them.
Yeah. I mean, people wonder why I get a bit cynical about boxing today. I don't want to malign anybody. I mean, you know, George, you go up those 6 steps into the ring, you're a special person as far as I'm concerned. But having the Ali era was over, and I mean, when Joe Louis retired, they said, well, our boxing's finished. And then along came Marciano. When Marciano retired, that was it. Boxing's finished. Then along came Ali. Ali retired, and then we had what became known as the Four Kings. As you say, Leonard, Hagler, Hearns and Duran. And of the 9 fights, I was very lucky to have covered 7 of them. And each one was special. Mm. The first Leonard Duran fight in Montreal, to me, and I've covered a few, was the greatest single fight I've ever seen. It had everything. It had speed, skill, bravery. If you wanted to show young boxers in amateur clubs what boxing's all about at the highest level, show them the film of that 15-round fight. No knockdowns. I don't think there was a drop of blood spilt, but it had me and a lot of others in that Olympic Stadium in Montreal on the edge of our seats from first round to last. To me, it was magic. It was what I was watching boxing for, to see a fight like that.
Who was the favourite before the fight? What was everyone thinking?
I wouldn't like to say what the bookmaking favourite was. I mean, I think I picked Leonard to win.
It's a bigger guy, wasn't he?
By,
he was the bigger guy. Duran was the smaller guy.
Yeah, well, Duran was arguably the greatest lightweight who ever lived. I mean, pound for pound. I mean, Leonard, to me, was pound for pound the best fighter I've ever seen. He had everything. He had charisma. He could punch. He could box. Yeah. He had bravery. He had everything. For me, he was. There's no such thing as perfection. We know that, but he was the nearest fighter to perfection I have ever seen. A lot of people will say, "No, Duran beat him, so he was." You know, just think of the second fight. Yeah, he had with Duran. He fought Duran's fight, the first fight. That's why he lost by that much, by a quarter of a point, I think it was. But second fight, he fought his fight, and he sickened Duran. You know, and he quit. Yeah. He didn't quit because he wasn't brave, because he was being made to look a fool.
Yeah.
That time as a boxing writer, were you aware of how special it was when you're in there and there's these 9 fights, this series of fights, and they're all fighting each other and they're the best? Are you thinking, wow, this is a great time, or are you just kind of getting on with it?
You know, they're all great characters and they were all very pro-media.
Were they?
Oh, yeah. I was just trying to think who wasn't pro-media. Foreman wasn't, excuse me, during his career. He wasn't pro-media, but most of them were pro-media. They knew to get people to watch on television, they had to use the media to sell themselves. Now they couldn't give a damn for the written press, I'm afraid, most of them.
Well, they got other avenues, don't they?
It's all television and, you know, so the boxing writer of today doesn't have the advantages that we had in my era.
What was Haggler like to interview?
I mean,
I would have thought he was a bit sticky.
Haggler was great.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to think, you see, we regarded these guys, although as friends, if you like. I mean, they promoted boxing through us, and they were very helpful at all times. Nothing was too much trouble for 90%. Obviously, used to get the odd 1 or 2 who couldn't be bothered. I mean, Tyson was a bit difficult. in his day and age, growing up, after he'd won the title and King got hold of him. He was a different man from when he started, when he was with other people. But most of them were very pro-media and wanted to help us because they knew by helping us, they were helping themselves. So, sorry, George, you asked me about one specific...
Haggler,
yeah. I mean...
Yeah, I would imagine he'd be surly, and that's how he came across as this sort of monster at middleweight.
Haggler didn't want to see me when I first tried to see him.
Were you smoking?
No, not because I was smoking. It was down to Alan Minter, I'm afraid. I wasn't there at this particular press conference, but Alan Minter made a remark when he said, it was reported, unfortunately, I'm not going to lose my title to any black man. Now, I'm not saying Alan Minter was a racist, and I'm not saying that at all. But that's what he said, and that's what was reported. And it got reported back to Brockton, Massachusetts, where Haggler lived. And Haggler was livid. Now, he was going to fight Minter at Wembley, and my boss, I worked for him for 19 years, said, who is this man, Haggler? And to be honest, I didn't know too much about him. He'd fought Chris Finnegan's brother twice in Boston and beat him and cut him to ribbons, actually, on both times, Kevin. So I knew about him, but I'd never met him. And he'd fought Antifermo for the world title and got a draw, so Antifermo kept the title. Antifermo gave it up, and then he came to London to fight Minter, who had beaten Antifermo. Sorry, he didn't give it up. Minter beat Antifermo, was the new champion. So Haggler came to London to fight him. And he'd made that remark about, I'm not going to lose to any black man. So my boss sent me out to see Haggler on the island of Provincetown, just off Boston. Used to get a 20-minute hop over in a plane to Provincetown. And I'd never met Haggler, and I'd never met the Petronetti brothers who managed him. But I made contact with them and found out that I could go and see them in his training camp. Goody was his trainer, and the other one, whose first name escapes me at the moment, they said, okay, come out and you can interview Marvin. I didn't realise that remark had been made and been reported back in the local paper in Brockton. And when I arrived in Brockton, it was in just after Labour Day in September. Provincetown's a resort, and it had been packed and was emptied out after Labour Day, so the place was virtually empty. Anyway, I checked into the hotel, and I went into the bar area, and there was two guys sitting there. It was the Petronelli brothers. And I walked over to him. I'm Colin Hart from London. Oh, how do you do? He said, sorry, I'm going to have to tell you, Marvin has refused to see you. I said, do what? I've just travelled 3,000 miles at enormous expense. I said, you kidding me? He said, no. He said, he's been in all the Brockton and papers what Minter had said about him, and he doesn't want anything to do with the British media. So I gave him a sob story straight away. I said, oh dear, I'm going to lose my job. And he said, I said, my boss has sent me out here at enormous expense. I said, I'm going to tell him Haggler won't allow me to interview him. He ain't going to be too pleased. Anyway, he said, I'll tell Aunt Marvin. And he told Haggler that this guy had arrived from London. He's going to lose his job, and he's married, he's got kids. I mean, I really laid it on thick. I wouldn't have lost my job, but I told a big white lie. Eventually, Haggler, being the guy he was, he relented, and he saw me. And we had an association ever since then, Marvin and myself. And that's when I first met Marvin Haggler. And it was very interesting because he was a great fighter, as you know, and I tipped Leonard to beat him because I didn't think anybody could beat Leonard, even though Leonard was a better welterweight than he was a middleweight. And I don't know too many people who picked Leonard to be Hagler. But Haggler was one of my favourite men, and he was in Newark, New Jersey, when they had the race riots there, and they had his wife's name was Bertha, who was at Wembley that night when they threw the bottles into the ring after he beat Minter, and they chucked bottles into the ring from way in the gods when they thought he headbutted Minter and cut him to ribbons. He didn't. It was in his fists. So we're in the passageway at Wembley waiting to interview Haggler and Minter, and Bertha, his wife, was there, and some of these guys got in that area and they abused Bertha horribly. So it was a nasty moment in British boxing. There was a board inquiry over it and everything. Yeah. And to be fair, Minter had nothing to do with that. Absolutely nothing to do with it.
Yeah, he didn't box in the UK again after that.
Anyway, so Haggler, one point I was going to tell you about, he lived in New Jersey, Newark, when the race riots happened, and that's when Bertha, his mother, not Bertha, took Haggler and his brothers, I forget how many had brothers and sisters, out of Newark and went to Brockton.
Because of the riots? Because
of the race riots, yeah. Oh yeah, he was a great guy, Haggler. I thought we had a great rapport in the end, Marvin and I.
Did you, best middleweight do you think you ever seen? Do you think Haggler was?
The best middleweight I ever saw in the flesh, I think so, yeah.
The most iconic fight for me, that Fab 4 era, is Haggler versus Hearns. Was you at that?
Yeah, I was working for the BBC at the night as well as my paper, doing the quote inter-rounds with Ian Darke, who was the commentator. And, they, at the end of the round you come in, you got a minute to give your opinion what you'd seen. And I was watching, I'll never forget it, sitting just a few seats along was Sugar Ray Robinson, who unfortunately was not 100% by then, but he was there, sitting a few seats away. And of course I had the cans on, working at ringside and microphone. And I watched that first round, and you guys who've been to Las Vegas know it's a desert heat, very dry. And it was in the open air, of course. And I'm sitting there watching that 3 minutes with my mouth open. And of course, I'm as dry as a bone. And when Ian Darke said, now over to Colin, I couldn't speak. I was speechless.
You went down to speechless.
And I grabbed my water and took a slug, swallowed it, and then I started to speak. I was in awe of what I'd just seen. And, it was the most brutal 3 minutes I'd ever seen. I'd covered a lot of fights by then. It was unbelievably brutal.
Yeah, you don't really see hardly any fights where it's just 0 to 100.
Unrelenting.
Let's just go until one man drops.
Now, now then, we get in the press room afterwards, and of course, eventually Haggler knocked him out in the third round. And we were all talking, we've all done our work, and we're talking, that has got to be the most brutal round I'd ever seen in my life. And there was an old boy sitting in the corner of the press room. He came from Reno. He was an old journalist. I don't know how old he was, but he wore a Stetson. And he's sitting there listening to us young bucks talking about this must got to be the most brutal. And suddenly he piped up. Yeah, he said, since Dempsey Furpo, 1923. I don't know if you've ever seen a film of that first round. when Dempsey went out the ring and was pushed back in, I think it was 7 knockdowns in that first round.
He had a good point, your man in the press room.
But there's always someone who will top you,
Yeah. I was interested in, just before we have a break, that we talked a lot there about Muhammad Ali, Foreman, Haggler, great fighters that aren't from the UK. In your time covering the sport, which British fighter do you think demanded the most column inches? Who got in the paper the most?
Column inches, I don't know about that, but I'll tell you, I've often been asked that question, Dec. I can lump 3 together. I don't want to separate them. The 3 I lump together, John Conte, Ken Buchanan and Joe Calzaghe. As 3, pound for pound, present company.
He's number 1, obviously.
I've been on. They, to me, pound for pound, the 3
they're the ones.
Greatest British fighters I've covered. I'm not saying there's ever been, but for me, they were 3 greatest. Conte never lived to his full potential, in my opinion. And John and I mean, we are personal friends, and we fell out big time. And we fell out over his lifestyle. John lived, after he became world champion, he lived the good life, the playboy life. He was always in Tramp, famous British nightclub. And John and I fell out. We never spoke for 2 years because he had a fight at the Anglo-American Sporting. He'd lost his title to Matthew Saad Mohammed.
Matthew Saad, of course.
Right.
Go on, do that bit.
No, I forgot what I was going to
So he'd lost his title to Matthew Saad Mohammed.
Yeah.
Conte,
Conte had lost his title in 2 fights he had with. He tried to get it back. He lost them both to Matthew Saad Mohammed. He was trying to get back to world level. He had a fight at the Anglo-American Sporting Club. His opponent, his name escapes me, and he got a very lucky draw. Harry Gibbs was the referee. And I wrote a line in my copy, in my fight report, which said, John had better stop training in Tramp and go back to the gym. And of course, I don't know whether John read it, but he was certainly told about it. And I hadn't seen him for weeks after, but I was in the gym at the Wellington George Francis gym at Hampstead talking to one of the fighters, and in walked John and saw me and slung his bag in the corner, and he glared at me, and I knew why. And I said, "You got something to say to me, John?" He said, "I thought you were a friend of mine." I said, "Yeah, I am. Why?" "What you wrote after that fight at the Anglo-American?" I said, "Yeah, I wrote it because I am a friend of yours." Anyway, we didn't speak for a long time after that. But, I was trying to say to him, you'll never get it back unless you've lived the life. And if that's why I say he never realised, for me, 50% of his potential. He could have been a light heavyweight champion for years, but he lived it up and regretted it afterwards and became an alcoholic, I'm afraid.
Lennox sneak in there? Does Lennox sneak in there? Where does he fall on that?
He's one of the
best.
He's the best heavyweight we've ever had, obviously. But, I mean, he would be a very close runner-up to the 3 men I mentioned. I mean, Buchanan was an amazing fighter, but he was with the wrong firm. He was promoted by Jack Solomons, who was then on the fringe of a great promotional career. Whereas if he'd have been with the Harry Levine, Mickey Duff outfit, he would have been far greater known in Britain, and he would have been a superstar. But unfortunately, he was with Eddie Thomas, was his manager. You all remember that Buchanan won his world title in Puerto Rico and never defended it in this country. He defended it all the time in America. And he was a superstar at Madison Square Garden, where they loved him. And that is one of the toughest audience in the history of boxing. They knew their boxing, the people who went to Madison Square Garden, believe me. And I was lucky enough to cover several fights there.
There you go.
Brilliant.
So should we have another quick break?
Yeah.
And then we're coming back, I'm assuming, Deck, with the best feature we've ever...
This is the best feature we've ever done. We've done a few. This is the best one we've ever done. George, remind me again, how become an elite club member?
Well, get a GGBC cap.
Done. What else?
Well, you could wear the hoodie.
Anything else?
Well, have you got a water bottle?
Anything else?
You could get a print for the wall.
It's cost me a fortune. Anything else?
Well, this is what it takes to be elite, Deck.
Does that mean I'm in the club now?
Nearly. One last thing. Just hit the follow button in your podcast app. Welcome to the club, Deck.
Oh, we'll have a push and a pull, mate. Right, George, we're back.
We're back.
Colin, we're back. So every episode we have a feature. Feature is a quiz. The quiz name is something to do with the guest. Now, Colin Hart is a great punnable name.
Yep.
Could have gone with anything.
Do you know what it puns with, don't you? I've been called out a few times. When I was a young man, I tell you at school.
Well,
what it rhymes with.
Yeah.
What Hart rhymes with.
Yeah. What were you called at school?
Fart.
Colin Hart.
Colin Hart.
Don't worry, I managed to swerve that. That was going to be my first choice. Feature, George, is called Heart of the Matter. Right.
Right.
Now this.
Okay.
Now this is a quiz. It's going to be you go, I go. Don't look at the answers.
I'm not looking. No.
You're against George. Now each of these answers has some correlation to a body part. Called heart is a famous body part, spelt differently, but fine. Okay, poetic license. Do you want to go, Colin? Do you want to go first or second? Got a list of questions. There's 10.
I'll go first.
Okay. Colin, Grand Rapids born Hall of Famer with wins over Evander Holyfield, Mike McCallum and Michael, second to none. No victory over Roy Jones.
Related to a body part.
Related to a body part.
Yeah.
So there must be a body part in his name, Colin.
Have you got it?
Wins over Evander Holyfield.
Mike McCallum and Michael Nunn. I must say that Evander Holyfield is a bit of a curveball, but
yeah,
it's true. It's on the record. But a clue, no wins over Roy Jones.
Yeah, well, I know from Grand Rapids was Mayweather.
Floyd Mayweather, yeah, I thought you might say that. It's not him.
Yeah, well, no, it's not him. He's not a body part. He's a piece of work.
This one is a double body part as well, just putting it out there. Do you know who it is?
You're not doing like, it's not like Tony.
When Holyfield was obviously a lighter weight,
or
must have been a cruiserweight.
Someone went up to heavyweight and beat him.
I'll say this guy beat Evander Holyfield after he'd beaten both Mike McCallum and Michael Nunn.
Oh, I've got it.
You got it?
I got it, yeah.
Okay, you got any idea? Throw it over.
James Toney.
There we go, James Toney.
Oh my
Thank
God.
you.
These are
Thank you. We're off to a flying start.
Oh
now,
my
all the
God.
best with this one,
I
George.
didn't know he beat Evander Holyfield.
Yeah, he did.
I should have known
Sunderland. Now this one's this. You
I'm
might
trying to be serious.
You might, yeah. There, forget that. You might not get this one, but let's see. Sunderland's former European light welterweight champion, who lost in his challenge to the British title, lost in his challenge for the British title to Robbie Davis Jr. in 2018. From Sunderland, body part.
Sunderland, I've already got Tony Jeffrey.
First name.
It's
Glenn.
not.
Sorry?
It's not just people called Tony.
Yeah, I know.
First name is Glenn.
Glenn Foot.
Glenn Foot. Very good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You'll
From
get
Sunderland, yeah?
Yeah, you'll get this one, I think.
I better.
Pressure's on.
Otherwise
Yeah, you're 2-0 down.
I'll get fired from this job.
James Smith was a heavyweight with wins over Frank Bruno, Tim Witherspoon, and
James Covered Smith.
what was his nickname?
I've just said James Bone Covered Smith.
Brilliant.
Very good.
Someone called James Smith.
So you give me legitimate questions.
Yeah. Someone with a name like James Smith, you need a proper fearsome nickname, don't you? It can't be James Smith, be a heavyweight. Anyway, Bone Crusher Smith, very good. Okay, your old mate George. In 2019, and Elite Club member Anthony Agogo had an operation to fix a damaged nose. But from which body part did they glean the bone with which to do it?
Well, it must have been from his rib.
Very good. Rib, 3-1. Were you there? Were you there?
I had mine taken from the rib. So
Perfect. Okay. In 2003, Colin, Mike Tyson famously revealed he boxed with a broken back. So that's the body part bit in his post-fight interview. I broke my back, spinal, he said. But who had he just vanquished inside a round? Famously, in his post-fight interview, he said, I broke my back in training. But who had he beaten in a round? 2003.
2003.
You were probably there.
No. I didn't cover Tyson after he'd lost his world title.
This was those times. Any idea, George, who we got?
Is it Clifford Etienne?
Yes, it is. You're not reading the answers.
No, I just remember that's the only one I remembered he'd done him
Clifford
in a round.
Etienne?
Yeah.
Clifford Etienne, yeah. And he said he beat him with a broken back.
Yeah, but you said, I thought the name had to be a body part.
No, the back bit is the body part there.
Oh, my God. I'm trying to think of name.
Yeah,
don't worry.
Fair.
I was at that fight.
You were?
Yeah,
You were there?
Memphis.
Memphis, exactly. And Jim Gray said...
Yeah, my wife comes from just up the road.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
1 round job. Okay. George, what was Vitaly Klitschko's ring moniker?
Dr. Steelhammer Fist?
Wrong. Vitaly Klitschko, Colin, to get one back on the board. Vladimir had a nickname, so did Vitaly.
Oh.
Yeah, you remember this?
Yeah, Dr.
Iron Fist. Dr. Iron Fist.
Oh,
Which is more fearsome, a steel hammer or an iron fist?
I think steel was stronger than iron, isn't it?
Is it? Okay. This is for you, Colin. Andrew Lewis was a Guyanan southpaw who lost his WBA welterweight title to Ricardo Mayorga in 2002. And he was famously stopped in the 7th round of his 2006 clash with Denny Dalton because he had to use the toilet. He said he had a dodgy protein shake and basically needed to go and have a number 2. But what was Andrew Lewis's nickname?
I have to be honest, I have no clue.
Knew this one?
The shitter, wasn't it?
No. Andrew Six Heads Lewis.
Oh.
Remember him? Ever cover him?
No.
A good one for you, George. You boxed on this card. Which heavyweight was stopped in a round by Anthony Joshua in May 2014 and never boxed again? You paid this bloke's wages. It was your pay-per-view.
Yeah.
Never
Well,
boxed
did Joshua opponent?
Joshua beat this man.
He beat Dominic Brazil.
Nope. But
And then he beat...
Wembley Stadium on your undercard.
Oh, right. On my undercard. Fuck knows.
Do you remember this guy?
No.
Matt Legg. No, I can't remember Matt Legg. I interviewed Matt Legg.
Yeah?
Well, he lost in a round, never boxed again. Definitely get this
There was
one,
no
Colin.
second leg, no.
Who was the first boxer to hold world titles in 3 weight classes at the same time?
Henry Armstrong.
Lovely.
See,
Straight in.
No body. Just give me proper body questions.
That's a good one there. Armstrong.
Yeah.
The arm, of course, for part of the body. You won't get this, or will you? Armenian southpaw, known as the Raging Bull, who was a former IBF flyweight champion, your favourite division, before he was stopped by Nonito Donaire, and he also boxed Jorge Arca, Abner Mares, and Nicholas Walters. First name Vic.
Was he the big puncher? Was he that big punching one?
Armenian southpaw, known as the Raging Bull.
He's got to be a big puncher, isn't he?
Raging Bull was
Yeah, there's only one Raging Bull.
I had no idea.
Vic Darchinian. You see, I was scraping the barrel there. Okay, well, I think, George, you won that. Did you think you won?
Yeah.
You got Henry Armstrong in a second, though.
Yeah.
Who's your favourite? You say Sugar Ray Leonard was the best.
But
pound for pound best.
pound for pound, he's the best fighter who I ever saw in the flesh. You talk to Reg Gutteridge and Harry Carpenter and guys, Peter Wilson there of the Daily Mirror, they all swear, and nobody argues with them, that the greatest fighter of all time was Sugar Ray Robinson. I mean, he went unbeaten as a welterweight in over 100 fights. I mean, the first man to beat him was Jake LaMotta, who was a middleweight, of course. Yeah. And they fought 6 times, and that was the only one he won.
What's your favourite venue to watch boxing at, Colin?
Well, I love York Hall.
Yeah.
Because to me, that's where you get, that's grassroots boxing. That's where you get the most knowledgeable crowd. I mean, I don't want to malign people who spend good money to go to boxing now, but because I'm an old cynic. But when you got a big fight at the O2, I used to think a large majority of that audience go to sing Caroline.
Yeah.
They don't know a left hook from a coat hook.
Yeah.
Right? And it's on there, most of them are young, and it's on their way to the nightclubs.
Yeah.
That's my cynical opinion. You go to York Hall, they go for the boxing. And that's where you get the real, grassroots boxing and the grassroots fans. But as an arena, because of the magic of the name, I'm lucky enough to have covered many fights, Madison Square Garden.
Yeah.
The Mecca, if you like, of boxing. Although was it the third or the fourth garden?
Yeah. And that ring was changed in...
The ring they use at the Garden for most of the famous fights is now in Canastota at the Hall of Fame.
And that would top Vegas for you? Madison Square Garden would beat any Vegas venue for you?
For me. Yeah. But I'm an old cynic, an old fart, an old everything, if you like. I mean, that's the magical name, isn't it? Madison Square Garden. I mean, look, I've seen great fights in Vegas, no doubt about it. But it's a completely different atmosphere. I can't wait to get back to the tables.
Yeah.
Two-sided question here. So, favourite ever fighter, but I want... is that Sugar Ray Leonard? Favourite and best are different. So if you have a favourite fighter that you like to watch, but also your favourite fighter that you covered.
Oh, Ali.
Is that for both?
Oh, no, the greatest fighter I say for me as a fighter. Yeah. I mean, whenever did you see Ali punch to the body?
So he's your favourite?
To me,
Leonard
is the greatest, pound for pound, the greatest fighter I've ever seen in the flesh. Right, and I tipped him to be Haggler, by the way.
Yeah.
And I didn't do it out of sentiment. I want to make that clear, because I knew he was clever enough to do it. And of course, a lot of it was up here. I mean, I know a lot of people thought Haggler won that fight, but not for me, he didn't.
And when you cover boxers, you kind of go on a ride with them. You said that over the years you go home and away and you see them.
Watch them train.
Yeah, and you watch them train, you spend time with them.
The only thing I will tell you, I'm glad I didn't go and watch Leonard on his last day of sparring before he fought Haggler. There's a very, very good American boxing writer called Mike Katz, who was of my era. And Mike and I both agreed that Leonard would beat Haggler. He was going to tip Leonard, and I certainly was going to tip Leonard. And Mike made a mistake. He went to see the last day of sparring at Taco's gym in Vegas, and he looked terrible. And he came back and he changed his mind. Maybe if I'd have been at that last sparring session, he might have changed my mind, but I wasn't there. So Mike tipped Haggler in the end, and I tipped Leonard. Listen, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to think I'm a genius at this tipping winners. I've been wrong many
What's the worst?
Times.
What's the biggest howler?
I'll tell you the worst, without any question, right? But I feel if I was wrong for the right reasons. The one unprofessional forecast I made was Ali and Holmes. I was talked into it by Angelo, who told me Ali had never been in better shape, which was nonsense, but he looked good. I didn't realise he had been on diuretics to get his weight down. He was false. He is in no shape, really, and he was way, way past his best. Angelo did a job on me. He suckered me into it, and I tipped Ali to beat Holmes, and it was pure sentiment, and it was unprofessional, and I was ashamed of it at the end because he was so shocked it wasn't even true. But the rest of the time I've been wrong. I like to think I was wrong for the right reasons.
Amazing, Colin. We've got one last question for you.
This could be anything.
So we asked each and every one of our guests to pick a ring walk track that they would have had if they were to box. What would have been the music that they would have ring walked to?
Oh, easy. I'm going to answer that without finishing the question. I'm forever blowing bubbles. I've been a West Ham fan from the age of 4.
That's brilliant. Like Kevin Mitchell, I bet you loved that when Kevin Mitchell was coming out to that.
Well, Kevin, there's a man who should have won a world title.
I'm Forever Blown Bubbles. That's not on the list yet, is it?
It's not on the list yet.
We're going to get lots of so we have this playlist, and our listeners.
I'll sing it to you. If you want.
No, you're right. Maybe we'll sing us out. But our listeners will put this on in the gym, and you'll get lots of non-West Ham fans skipping this now. But look, it's on the list now. That's Colin Hart's entry.
That is awesome, Colin. Thank you so much for coming in today.
We could have gone on for hours.
This is my pleasure. Look. Number 1, I love the sound of my own voice. And number 2, I could talk boxing 24/7.
And thanks for not smoking today.
Yeah.
Well. I mean, I didn't have to get George Foreman.
I did give up 40 odd years ago, and I'd still ended up with throat cancer. So there you go.
One question before we start, I just wanted to ask. First impressions of George when you were covering him back in the day.
Well,
what was he like to cover?
I'm going to be honest.
I thought he was a knob.
Never heard of him.
I saw George, when he was an ABA champion, and I realised he was a bit special. But I did tip
James DeGale
to beat him.
Yeah, I thought that was going to be his worst prediction.
Yeah. That's why I saved it to the end.
My worst prediction was Ali to beat Hearns.
Second
50-50.
was James DeGale to beat George Grove. That's brilliant, Colin. Thanks so much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Colin.